Writing, I will introduce. But to just get started, I thought you could talk just a little bit about the book, about just broadly the story. I know we don't want to give away too much when you're talking about a book, but I'm interested if you would just review it with everyone.
So the book is told in alternating chapters. One is told by a member of the Vietnamese Airborne Brigade. And as I said, it's a very sweeping historical context. It spans a period of 40 years. And that's on purpose. I wanted to have history be almost one of the characters in the novel. So every event that I think are household events in America, such as 68 Tet Offensive, I think most people who study American history have heard of that. I've heard of the 1973 Paris Peace Accord. And the story is told with that setting in the background. But I also realized that you have to have human emotions in novels. So the alternating story is told by a little girl, and that brings the war back into a sort of everyday life, the way people lived in times of war. So the book takes place during wartime, but it's juxtaposed against family life. And somewhat of a sort of a love story, kind of love story as well.
And there are many themes in the book, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the theme that you find most important or that you most want the readers to recognize.
For me, probably the most important theme is to talk about the theme of peace, war, and peace. I wrote the book basically because I have a full-time job teaching. So most of my writing took place at night, from 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, until maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. So, when you write at night, your soul wanders differently than if you write in the daytime when you have the moon outside the window rather than the sun outside the window. You're in a different state of mind. It's almost like a piece of music that's played in the major key versus minor key. It has a shifting tone. And so when you write about war at night, a lot of things come out. It's almost like blood. You see blood and then it coagulates into a scatter. And that's how I think of the process of writing fiction about war. And the theme for me is this. What is it like to be from a country that fights a war with a superpower on the side, but you yourself are a very significant part of that superpower. So what does it mean to be allied with a country that fights a war, and that war is fought on your own land, but the war is controlled and managed in Washington, D.C.? And I think that is a very important theme for me, because that theme is a theme that the United States continues to play out, whether it fights in Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Syria, or anywhere else. Any country, I think, that is a non-European country. I'm not talking about, if Paris were attacked, the U.S. would react very differently, but a small country that is only part of the geopolitical struggle. That's the story I'm telling. So it's almost like you're really a fleet in the geopolitical world, and so you can be crushed in time. So that's what the book is about, and it's really about loyalty versus betrayal. That's another very important thing in this book, because I have found that having come to the U.S. and gone to college in the United States and also gone to law school in the U.S., I've met so many Americans who have very, very strong views about the war. And whether the American I speak with are from the right or the left, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, they all have a very American-centered view of the war. In fact, they are much more in common with each other than they realize they are. They think that, oh my God, it's a blue state and a red state, and we're very different. In the area of foreign policy or in the area, especially where Vietnam is concerned, very similar. So I wanted to tell the story from the perspective of somebody from a small country and a poor country, and a country that's really just part, like I said, as a geopolitical struggle in the Cold War. So that's a very big thing for me. War and peace. So when you've been abandoned, what is it that you do in order to survive and have trust? So this is played out in the book on a light level, but it's also played out in the book in personal level. So for example, if you read the book carefully, every character in the book, everything that happens to a character in the book, basically is reflected in the relationship in the U.S. and South Africa.
Now I feel like I have to read parts of it over again. Can't tell that. We were talking a little bit before we came out about what it means to have an American lens on foreign policy and on Vietnam in particular. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see that expressed, either through individuals or even through the way we think about Vietnam, and I'm talking about Americans, when we think about Vietnam today, and what does that make you think about as it relates to not both your book, but also to the future of the relationship between Vietnam and the United States?
I was just at a conference yesterday at Santa Clara Law School, and I gave a talk about corporate social responsibility. And it was very interesting. One of my panelists gave an example of a study, a psychology study, in which you have these basketball players who are throwing the ball back and forth to each other. And the subjects of the study are these students. And they are told, watch the basketball players and count how many times they pass to each other. Just count, and then tell us. Then the designer of the psychology study had a man wearing a gorilla suit walk across the basketball court. And interestingly, at the end of the game, it was only 15 minutes they were counting, and the audience, who are the subject of the psychology study, were asked, did you notice anything different? The majority never saw the gorilla. They only saw the passing of the ball. And immediately, it reminded me of Vietnam. And how does it remind me of Vietnam? Because the Americans think they know all about Vietnam. Okay? But there's a gorilla right there, and that's the South Vietnamese refugees who had left their lives in Vietnam to come live here. They have no idea that there's a gorilla here. Why is the gorilla here? They don't even know it's a gorilla. They are only interested in counting how the ball is passed. So where Vietnam is concerned is a huge blind spot for America. It only comes up, let's say, during a presidential debate, and they say, okay, was so-and-so a draft dodger? Did so-and-so? What's your point of view on the war? But it's very American-centric. And it's American-centric because the U.S. view of the world is that it is the only country that matters. Everything is told from the American perspective. And it's amazing how if you leave the U.S., you realize that people do not think they are centered. And again, give you a small example. I taught in Austria one summer. The entire summer I was in Austria and listening to the traffic report in Austria. I was in Innsbruck. I taught international economic law, and just listening to the traffic report, the radio announcer said, and to the west, if you're coming from Munich, you're going to have such and such traffic jam. And if you're coming from the south, from Italy, you're going to have such and such a traffic jam. If you're coming from the east, Vienna and Budapest. So a person who lives in Innsbruck, just listening to something so mundane as a traffic report, understand that they are embedded in an international war because they have neighbors who are from other countries. But here, we're very much isolated in terms of seeing just everything in terms of American policy. So if you look at Vietnam, there's a very typical story, right, which is the war was unwinnable, the South Vietnamese were just a bunch of crooks, and they can't fight. We wasted all the time and energy on them, and why? And you have to ask yourself, why is that story told? That story is told because the Americans have to maintain the myth about themselves, which is we never abandon anybody. Okay? We fight the last fight, but how can you reconcile that myth? That claim, this is a city on a hill, as Ronald Reagan gets said, right? A shining city on a hill, where all refugees are welcome and we never abandon our allies. If you want to maintain that story about yourself, the only way to explain why you didn't win with the war is to blame everything on your allies. And therefore, the idea that South Vietnam is an undeserving country and the North Vietnam is more deserving is the mainstream narrative. So I find that narrative unbelievably disturbing and very painful because it's just not true.
So I'm going to ask a question. I'm actually going to ask the question of the audience. And not, for those of you who are not Vietnamese, I'm curious about this. Is that the narrative that you have of Vietnam? And you know, the only reason I'm asking that question is because what's weird, I think, as we were talking, and even as I was reading your book, and now I'm reflecting on some of what I read to say, did I understand that? But I think one of the opportunities with you writing this book in English, which is, you know, an important opportunity, is that we English speakers get to learn more about the world, and not just in a political frame, but in that very interpersonal and emotional frame, like where you have to consider your relationship with your mother, your father, your siblings, your sister, your brother. I think that's the first, and I think the second thing is that, you know, and it's interesting because we were talking about how I do think we have a very American lens about a lot of things, so I think that's accurate. I think what's interesting about this part of the world and the opportunity here is that 40% of the people who live in this county are foreign born. 40%. We have over 100 and something different languages spoken. Almost 50 or 60% of every household here speaks a language other than English at home. And so then the question becomes, and this is one of the reasons I was so excited to host this on your behalf, but one of the reasons that what's so exciting about your willingness and desire to put your moonlit soul, now I'm going to remember that, into this book, is it gives us an opportunity to have a much deeper relationship and a deeper dialogue. And so I wonder if the fact that we've had so many people from Vietnam as part of our communities, if that narrative is different here than it may be in other parts of the country. I don't mean entirely, but I mean whether or not that's the case. Because this, you know, just as a question, and I guess the follow-up question to you would be relative to writing the book in English. What is your hope relative to what Americans take away from this experience, this lovely family?